Okay, good. So, welcome to tonight's session, which is called Working with Fear. Um, it's kind of an interesting talk that I gave a number of years ago. I think it was back in 2015. The Vipassana Sangha here in Santa Fe invited me to come in and do a talk. They invited me for a few talks, which was kind of nice. Um, but anyway, the woman who was coordinating all the talks there, she said, we never hear much about fear in Buddhism, and I'm curious what your take is on that. And of course, with everything that is going on in our modern world, there's lots of need to kind of look at that topic. So hopefully tonight will be instrumental. I'm also going to bring in to tonight a really recent talk that Venerable Rabina gave that has to do with fear and the coronavirus and all that. I'm going to try to keep everything very topical in terms of similar to what I did on Wednesday night. But let's go ahead and start tonight with just a recitation of the refuge prayer. So we won't do the mandala offering prayer again. We'll just do the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. Again, the first two lines are about refreshing, renewing our sense of safe direction that we find in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, kind of renewing that within our own minds and hearts. And then in the second two lines, the motivation of bodhicitta that we'll meditate on shortly, but already bringing that to mind, thinking that we're here to engage in this discussion and exploration of this topic of working with fear so that we can develop our own minds and hearts and eventually become fully enlightened. And in that state, we can then help others perfectly. So let's recite this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shok Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shok. Okay, wonderful. Let's go ahead and start, as I usually do, with a short meditation. Give everyone a chance to kind of come into this space, this virtual Gampa that we have, by calming their minds a bit, becoming a bit more present. And then on the basis of that, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So again, we'll do a little exploration of this topic of working with fear as part of setting our motivation, but mostly just try to bring that best motivation of bodhicitta to these teachings. So find a good meditation posture, one that's suitable for you. And again, work with the breath in whatever way you find useful. I think every one of you, no doubt, has some technique that you use with the breath. And just try to keep the awareness with the breath. Whenever the mind wanders away, then the goal at that point is to recognize that first and then to gently bring the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime here on this end to start the meditation period. So now let's do a short investigation before we set our motivation. And I'd like you just to think about how fear is operative in your life. You can think about it certainly in the current time, though even looking back perhaps over the recent past or even earlier in one's life. But just, choose, a few things to think about in terms of, a fearful uh, episode that you had, something that sort of brought up that emotion. And not to re experience that fear, but rather to at least spend a moment to kind of see if you can determine where that fear came from. In Buddhism, we're very much about sort of deconstructing things, coming to understand where these various states of mind arise. So I'd like you again just to do that little exploration, pick out, one or more, if you wish, particular incidents where your fear arose in your mind, and see if you can determine sort of what was the process by which that fear arose. What are the causes and conditions for it? And moreover, maybe take a look at whether that fear really served a constructive purpose. And it's not to say that fear will never serve any purpose, but just to examine in the incidents that you've chosen or incident, whether that was actually something useful. And then finally, to cultivate the motivation of bodhicitta, let's think about what it would be like to live our lives kind of fearlessly, to recognize that there still will be things that arise in our lives, like the incidents that we've thought of that may seem somewhat threatening and difficult. But nonetheless, we can rise to the challenge. We can learn from those experiences, develop a fearless attitude. I say the state of Buddhahood that we are striving for, that is the object of this mind of bodhicitta, is a fearless state, one where there's no longer anything to fear. So maybe making a more temporal dedication thinking or motivation thinking, you're here tonight to explore how to be more fearless in the face of those things that are challenging. But moreover, to work on developing complete fearlessness, the state of Buddhahood, where in that state we will then be able to help others to be fearless, help others to develop themselves completely. Just hold that motivation for tonight so that everything that we do creates the causes for that eventual result, our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings. Okay, so as I said, this is a talk I've given a number of times, and the most recent time was actually here in Santa Fe when I was still in my period of resident teacher here, was when all of this started with coronavirus. And I think Venerable Rabina gave this talk or posted it on her webpage somewhere around April 9th or 10th, something in the beginning of April. She was already sort of, on it and reacting to things and what have you, as she's always so accurate and kind of pinpointing what's all going on. But so I'll be sharing a few of her words tonight as we go through this as well. And her teachings were very much in line with what I had been teaching previously when I've taught on fear. It is kind of interesting, fear is something that we do talk about on occasion in Buddhism. There are certainly some places in even the Lam Rim and the stages of the path where you will see that word used in terms of, a particular emotion that we are going to use in a very wholesome way, in a very positive way. Um, but nonetheless, fear has a lot of different dimensions to it. So it's important to spend a little bit of time examining it, taking a look at it, deconstructing it, figuring out what it's all about, because it isn't talked about perhaps as much as it should. So let's go ahead and do a little slideshow for tonight. Got maybe a few more slides than last night, but it's mostly like kind of outlines and things, some quotes. And I'm starting with a quote from Venerable Rabina from this talk that she gave. Be a couple of slides on that. She says, "It seems that there's nowhere on the planet right now that isn't suffering from the presence of the coronavirus and its consequences. And it's bringing so much fear and anxiety. This is natural, of course, but that doesn't mean we should take fear for granted. We shouldn't fall into the trap of believing that because fear is natural, we can't change it. Of course we can. That's the fundamental point that Buddha makes. That's the essence of his teachings and practice. Our mind is not set in stone. We can change it. And of course, what Venerable Rabina is saying there, we've all heard this before. We all kind of know that as the underpinning of everything that the Buddha taught, was that our minds are malleable, our minds are changeable. Certainly our minds are conditioned by what we have done in the past. This is something that'll come up here to some degree, even what we're going to talk about this weekend in terms of the four measurables. So we have certain patterns that we've gotten very familiar with. But that's only through the force of our own familiarity, because we haven't challenged those with opposing views, with opposing levels of awareness that, in the case of what the Buddha teaches, and he says this, but of course we need to investigate this, those things are more grounded in reality and in fact. We looked at this a little bit the other night when we talked about working with our problems and learning to like them and what have you. Tonight's talk touches on a few of the same themes, but it's of course going to be from the perspective of particularly this mind of fear. And so again, fear is a state of mind like any of the other things we talk about in Buddhism, the positive states, the negative states, and so on. This weekend, of course, we're going to be working with a lot of the positive states that are really useful to have to kind of keep us moving in that direction of enlightenment, bodhicitta, what have you. And so that'll be kind of focusing on that. What we've looked at on Wednesday night, as well as to some degree, tonight, is kind of negative states of mind that become problematic for us, that become obstacles for us. But they're only obstacles, again, if we don't learn from them. As we talked about on Wednesday night, everything is there for a reason. If we buy into the Buddha's teachings on karma, it means that all of our experiences are a ripening of our past karma. And so because of that, they're there to teach us, they're there to help us, and we can actually embrace them and use them. And fear is no different than all the other things we talked about on Wednesday night as well. It's an experience that we have. And again, we can analyze it, get into, and so we're going to look at tonight is dissecting it and figuring out where it comes from and what different types of fear we might want to address. And then we can decide how we want to use that, how we want to actually learn from that. And so this is, again, not something that we talk about maybe as much as we should in Buddhism, but fear it's kind of interesting. One thing that Venerable Rabina is going to mention in one of the later quotes that I have from her, which I actually brought up many years ago when I was studying over in Italy. In Italy at the master's program, one of the courses was dealing with the mental factors. And I brought up to our teaching assistant, Champa Gendon, well, where is fear on this list? Those of you who've studied Buddhist psychology know that in that study that's called Lorik, kind of minds and knowers, you get into the whole idea of there are 51 of these various mental factors that are set out. Some of them are very functional in terms of they just allow the mind to know and get at objects and what have you. And then, of course, we have all of the virtuous mental factors that flavor our minds in very positive ways. And then we have all of the afflictive states of mind, the root afflictions and the secondary afflictions. We have some mental factors that are changeable. Fear is not on the list. Fear is not one of these 51. And, when I asked the teaching assistant over there, he was like, yeah, he's noticed that too, but he's never really heard a good answer for why that isn't on there. if I were to put fear in any of these, of course, we have to decide what type of fear it is, but that may be why it would be in one of these changeable mental factors. Because as we're going to explore tonight, sometimes our fear can actually be a useful thing in terms of helping us to move in a more positive direction. But sometimes fear can become a bit more of an obstacle where we really are not moving forward. It can, have its effects on us. So we're going to get into this as we look at this tonight. But that's sort of the starting point, is to recognize that there's not a whole lot written about fear in the traditional text. When you go to study these mental factors as part of the FPMT's basic program, and you sort of delineate them all out, you go, well, where's fear on the list? And of course, they weren't meant to be exhaustive. Those 51 were taught because they are very instrumental in Buddhist teachings and helping us to understand Buddhist psychology. There are probably thousands of more mental factors that could be identified that are shades and variations on all of these various things. But we'll kind of take fear and put it in the category of, where does it fit in? Where does it derive from? What is it most closely associated with? So we'll take a look at that tonight as well. A little bit of a more technical exploration, but nonetheless, I think one that's very useful. So this is how I've divided up tonight. I like to do this, kind of give a sort of outline, and especially now that I'm using more PowerPoint presentations with the online format, I find that kind of helpful to keep myself on track, as well as certainly to present to the listening audience, the watching audience, some visual cues for what I'm doing in terms of my talk. So we're going to start with looking at what is fear. How would we define fear? What's its sort of flavor, if you will? And then where does fear come from? I mentioned a little bit about that already. What are the effects of fear? How can we see, especially these forms of fear that are not so wholesome? What effects do they have upon us? How do we work with it? Where again, we might touch on a few things that were similar to what we did on Wednesday night, but nonetheless, repetition is what the Dharma is all about, to keep hearing things again and again, and sometimes in different contexts it takes on a different flavor. So when we look at fear in particular, we see some of the same teachings, but a few additional teachings as to how to work with it. And then what does fearlessness look like? Which I already sort of talked about, alluded to in the motivation tonight. But so let's go into what is fear. I went right to the dictionary and found this definition of fear: a reaction to something that may happen in the future. It's kind of interesting. I mean, you can have fear, I assume, arising at something that's currently going on. If somebody's charging at you with brandishing a weapon, you might have some fear, but maybe you are still anticipating the future, until the point where they've actually, been disarmed, or whatever the case might be. But reaction to something that it's a future experience of pain and difficulty, problem that you are anticipating experiencing. And actually, this is how Tara Brach, many of you have heard of her, Buddhist teacher, not in the FPMT tradition, but she writes that fear is the anticipation of future pain. So it kind of does have that future orientation. It is something that we see sort of coming down the pike, and we're anticipating having to experience that. Of course, now when we look at what's going on with coronavirus, and certainly when Venerable Rabina did her talk, which was really towards the beginning of all of this, I know here in New Mexico, we shut down right around March 15th, and here she was already giving talks on this very shortly after. And so again, there was a lot of fear. There were a lot of unknowns. Wasn't much that people were being told about how to protect themselves, how this virus was transmitted, all these various things. So there was a lot of that anticipation of the future pain or difficulty that was driving a lot of people in very difficult ways, making life very stressful and anxious for a lot of people. So we can see, again, that fear does have that flavor of expecting that something is coming down the pike and that we're going to have to confront it and deal with it. And it's going to cause us difficulty, pain, some sort of suffering. So you can already see to some degree the psychology of where fear is coming from. Fear is not an anticipation of something that is delightful that's going to happen in the future, obviously. Chogyam Trungpa, in a wonderful little book that, I don't know, it's got some puzzling teachings to me. I love Chogyam Trungpa in a general way, but oftentimes I find when I get into his teachings, they can be a little difficult to kind of get heads around. But Smile at Fear has some nice things in it, some very nice things. He says fear is nervousness. loneliness. Fear is anxiety. Fear is a sense of inadequacy, a feeling that we may not be able to deal with the challenges of everyday life at all. We feel that life is overwhelming. And then there was one tricycle magazine, fall of 2017, that dealt with fear. That was kind of the main topic for that issue. Uh, this teacher, Dharmadvidya David Brazier, says fear is a given. It is a fundamental part of life and consciousness. And while it may not feel good, fear is useful and necessary. In spiritual life, the problem with fear lies in whether we have the wisdom to respond well to it. This is kind of the theme that I'm going to be working with tonight, is to sort of look at, well, you know, I can see the whole point of view of like, let's just abolish fear. Let's live our lives completely fearlessly. But as we're going to see, and even a later quote that I have, we need things to sort of threaten our well-being to be fearless in the face of. So I don't think we ever completely get rid of that sort of fear, or the potential to feel fear, until way further down the path, maybe until we've done a lot of the deeper work that gets rid of the fundamental root of where all this fear is arising. And of course, as I said in the motivation, in the Buddhist state, when we finally achieve enlightenment, as I said, where you experience what are called the four fearlessnesses, which are sort of your ability to, in the face of anything, know exactly what needs to be done, and know the wisdom that is required, and all of the various things. So it's only, I think, when you get to further states down the road that fear is completely abolished. So how do we work with fear? How do we actually use fear as something that can be, again, just in the same way that we talked on Wednesday night about the alchemy of Lojong, sort of there's an alchemy of fear. Fear is telling us something. Fear has its own sort of story that it's giving us, that we need to pay attention to and to kind of take a look at, and not become overwhelmed by it, which of course is the problem. When I was talking about when coronavirus first hit, there was a lot of that going around. I remember the first few grocery trips that I did, and the sense of anxiety, and even the anger that would come up here in Santa Fe. We don't really have that much of, like, people getting angry and upset at grocery stores, and but it was happening because people, when they have that fear that they're experiencing, they don't know quite how to make something positive out of that, and they become much more affected by it, and thereby don't make rational choices all the time, and don't behave rationally all the time. So that's maybe enough about what fear is. Let's go on to, where does fear come from? And as I said, there's nothing in the traditional Buddhist teachings that sort of delineate this, but this is sort of, again, the Buddha's view of fear, is that while there is a physical component to fear, we do have that sort of hardwired in our minds to some degree due to evolution, what they call, like that fight, flight, or freeze response that we have in our sort of lizard brain. Um, I don't know I never really studied all of that sort of science, but I've heard enough about it to know that scientists often feel that fear is sort of a hardwiring of us, that we will, and of course it served its purpose, right? Early on in our evolution, we needed to have some trepidation, some dread of things that could harm our lives. And so as mankind was developing, that fear served a useful purpose, because it made us aware of the things that threatened our very survival. And on the basis of that, then, by learning how to respond effectively to fear, we were able to continue to survive and develop as a species and what have you. But that's been sort of hardwired in our bodies for quite some time. And it's, again, not to say that that doesn't play a role in all of this. I know that when I feel fear, I feel the heartbeat start racing, I feel the adrenaline start rushing through. There's a physical effect of just being threatened, of having something in your face, a person, whatever, some situation, that is triggering that anticipation of future pain. But it's more than that. Again, as I was going to continue on the slide, although it is kind of has a physical dimension to it, it arises out of a conceptual process, meaning that it is primarily our mental reaction to something that threatens our well-being. And of course, this is true for, all of the delusions. Uh, People will say, well, they might feel they're hardwired to get angry. and upset. And so the second that they get threatened by something, that is how that manifests for them, that physical, welling up of things that causes people to get angry. Well, that's their perspective. But in Buddhist terms, anger is a thought process. It's a view. It's a way of looking at things. Fear is a view. It has a conceptual framework to it. It is a way of looking at what is going on and imbuing certain thoughts around that. You know, that may or may not be useful. Again, I'm not totally discounting fear as a useful component in our lives and certainly in our spiritual development. There are times when we're even encouraged to go to the place of experiencing some fear because it can be a great impetus to our spiritual practice. But nonetheless, there are a lot of times when fear has the opposite effect. It just causes us to get stuck and causes us to do things that we regret and so on. So again, this is the idea behind this, is that it's a mental process, and as a thought process then, fear is something that can be deconstructed and analyzed to see what it's about, to examine whether it abides in truth or not. And of course, this is what the Buddha excels at. This is what Buddhist psychology is all about, is to be able to look at something, a state of mind that we have, a thought process that we have, and to pick it apart from the point of view of seeing, well, why is it arising? Does it have something that is truthful within it? Does it abide in truth? If so, well, then I can pay attention to that and use that. If it doesn't, then I need to change my thought process. Then I need to look at things more truthfully, more in line with reality. So to begin with, the future pain that we are anticipating is also an anticipation of loss, of our no longer experiencing the sense of comfort or security we've somehow gotten used to having. So if we start getting deeper into this, we obviously see that this is part and parcel of the Buddha's teachings on impermanence, that what fear is threatening is a change in the status quo, a change in how we are normally going about things. I mean, I recall certainly in myself, as well as a lot of people, 4 years ago when we were holding the 2016 election, and the results of that election were not to many people's liking. There were certainly some people who it was to their liking, but for those who didn't find it to their liking, there was a lot of this sort of anticipation of the change that might happen. And I remember there being a lot of hyperbole at the time, some of which maybe was not so hyperbolic, but nonetheless, there were certainly a lot of people who were projecting things into the future that were very much about a real threat to the status quo, to how things were going on, to how one was living one's life. Certainly now we are looking at, a new election, and there will be another process, and there'll be no doubt another group of people, whoever that might be, our side, their side, whoever side, who goes through that process of anticipating the change that's going to happen. As human beings, we're not so fond of things changing. We really want to find a sort of comfort zone that we can stay in. And the way that I see fear is that fear threatens that. Fear is an introduction of something that says you're not going to be able potentially to continue doing what you're doing, having what you're having, being what you are. And certainly when we look at the pandemic that we're going through right now, this has been a big part of it, is that people have had to see a real disruption to the way they live their lives, to the way that they even communicate with others, to the way that they work if they are working. All of the various things have been affected by this. And people have been forced out of their comfort zone, forced out of where they felt they always wanted to sort of hang out and stay. And of course, the Buddha says that this is deeply rooted in our own misconception of things as being more unchanging than they actually are. We do see these grosser levels of change happening on occasion in our lives, but things are changing all the time. This is one of the most fundamental truths that the Buddha taught. It's the nature of things to change. Everyone wants to go back to some idyllic time, or to even go back to some time in their own personal life where they felt like, oh, if I could only be back there in this place where I lived and had this circle of people and this job and whatever the case might be. All those things change. It's impossible for us to not experience change because that's the very nature of our existence. and even the changing that's happening with each of our bodies every second or millisecond, continually, a process whereby we are aging and will eventually reach the end of the line when the aging stops and death occurs. This is the part and parcel of what we are involved in. And of course, fear flies in the face of all of that. It is giving us this, reality check that says, hey, things are going to change. Potentially they're going to change. You're going to have to experience some future painful thing, potentially. Again, fear doesn't always materialize. As I said, a lot of the fears that people were generating right after the last election were perhaps a bit exaggerated. But nonetheless, you know, it's that threat to the status quo that makes fear such a difficult emotion for us because we like our comfort zone. I was reminded of by a friend of mine several years back, and I kind of try to live my life by this, that we don't grow unless we're outside of our comfort zone. We don't actually change in more constructive ways unless we're yanked out of that. Even right after the pandemic started, I posted on Facebook to my friends a little query about, what is it that you are learning from the pandemic? It was based on a quote from Pema Chodron from her book, When Things Fall Apart, where she essentially said that things hang around as long as they need to give you the lessons you need to learn, in a sense. So if this is hanging around, and of course at that time it only been hanging around for a few weeks or something, but here it is, it's hanging around now. And I even saw the World Health Organization is saying maybe within 2 years we'll be free of this threat in our world. Now, again, that may happen sooner in developed countries. Who knows? I don't know, obviously, what's going to happen. But, you know, we've got a lot of learning to do. We have a lot of things to actually make good use of. But as I'm getting at with this whole idea of where does fear come from? Fear comes from an interruption to our assumption and our even expectation that things are continue to go in the way that we like. And of course, this is going to go into, when I get deeper into Buddhist psychology, the root afflictions that are all involved in this process. So this is a point that I made earlier, and I want to bring it in here as well. However, sometimes this anticipation of future pain or loss of comfort can be useful. For example, the fear that causes us to be more attentive to our actions due to not wanting unfavorable results. And this is one of the hardest things about the teachings on karma. We will look at karma a little bit later. But, when we hear about karma and we begin to subscribe to that idea, we think this is a good working hypothesis for how to go about living our lives. There is some trepidation, some fear that we need to have a healthy respect for the law of cause and effect, to recognize that we will have to experience the suffering consequences of the actions we engage in now. Our consciousness, maybe not in this life, but somewhere down the road, will have to see the fruition of all of that. Well, but this even happens within this life. The story that I often tell is when I was over in Italy studying. I had a wonderful time there for the 7 years I was there, but at the Institute itself, which of course Institute living and communal living has its own challenges, but they were very kind in providing the meals for everyone there. You had to pay, your room and board every month, but they would have all the meals cooked, so it was very convenient. But nonetheless, the chef there, who was responsible for all the meals, was making vegetarian meals, but the vegetarian meals were not very healthy. They were a lot of simple carbohydrates. You'd come down, there'd be like white pasta, and there'd be white rice, and there'd be potatoes, and there'd be, maybe carrots or something, and you like look at it and you go, wow, well, I guess I have to eat, so this is what I'm going to eat. Excuse me. And one time when I came home, I think this was around 2001 when I came home. It was after my father had passed away, and my mother said, maybe you should go see a doctor, because I hadn't been going to the doctor since I'd gotten over there, to get your blood work done and see what's happening. So I went to my father's doctor, and he did all of the analysis of things, and I flew back to New Mexico. I was already coming here because my partner was here, so I came here for the summer, and I get this call from my father's doctor, and he says, your blood work is really, really bad. He says, if you keep doing what you're doing, eating what you're eating, living the lifestyle you're living, and blah, 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 you're going to have the same problems your father had. You're going to get diabetes. You're going to have heart problems. You're going to have congestive heart failure. You're going to have kidney failure. You're going to have all the things that my father unfortunately went through that caused his death at 70 years old. So of course, what I don't jump up and down for joy when I hear this news. So the ramifications were that this instilled in me a fear, a trepidation of what would my life look like if I continued doing what I'm doing. So I made a decision when I went back to, my coming 9 months of being back in Italy, that I was going to take charge of my diet. I wasn't going to continue to eat the food at the Institute. And so I would go out and buy all my groceries for the week, and I would make my own food in my room, have to do my own dishes, all the various stuff that ate into a lot of my time over there, frankly. I mean, it's much easier to go down to the kitchen, grab your plate of food, eat your food, and just give your plate to the people who wash your dishes. I mean, it was very definitely something I had to sacrifice in order to have that. But I was able to, through that and exercise, was able to bring everything down to a more manageable level. Continue to pay attention to that, obviously. But this is a healthy fear, right? And it's just a mundane example. And maybe each of you have gone through something like that in your life, where you've been forewarned of something down the pike if you don't take charge of things now. Well, that can be a very healthy thing. Again, especially if I had just complete attachment to my life and really just wanted to continue to enjoy life and be very hedonistic, it would be very different motivation. But because I wanted to practice the Dharma, to use my life meaningfully, to be able to teach the Dharma, it becomes especially important to use those sorts of warning signs in a much more positive way. So whether it's the teachings on karma that I mentioned earlier, or even things in this life that we're threatened with, that's where right now, again with coronavirus, there's nothing wrong in having a healthy fear of this virus and taking precautions to not get infected, especially if you're going to, use your life in a meaningful way. If your motivation is really good, well then listen to that fear and respond to that fear in a constructive way. And again, throughout the Buddha's teachings, there are a number of these things that are pointed to as sort of things that we need to have a healthy regard for and a dread of, even. So let's go on then to talk a little bit about that idea of there being healthy or wholesome fear, as I see it, and an unhealthy or unwholesome fear. And it kind of mirrors. I never studied Freud. I was never, into psychology and what have you. But Freud apparently delineated real fear and neurotic fear. I'm not making these equivalent necessarily, but I think they do mirror each other. Because in Freud's mind, there was something that is a real fear that we need to pay attention to again, like our ancestors on the Serengeti plains or whatever, that needed to be attentive to what was happening so that they didn't lose their lives and so on. But then neurotic fear becomes problematic. And of course, that's the domain of a lot of Western psychology in terms of traditional psychology. Real fear, he would see as a rational and comprehensible response to the perception of clear and present danger. Real fear invites action. So again, that's where I would call fear one of these changeable mental factors, because if you actually are seeing what's going on and having a healthy response to it and saying, wow, I need to change something so I don't have to experience that painful event further down the road, well, then it has a lot of constructive components to it. Neurotic fear, on the other hand, which of course in Western psychology would be defined in maybe different ways than in Buddhist psychology, is a free-floating anxious expectation to any something or even nothing that catches the eye or the ear or the mental consciousness and so on, wherever that is coming in. This neurotic or expectant fear induces states of paralysis and ascribes a dreadful meaning to all uncertainty. So again, this was the Western psychology way through Freud's sort of exploration of what fear is all about. And he identified certainly, and of course that's where all of these phobias came from, right? Claustrophobia and agoraphobia and what have you. So again, there are different things that in Western psychology are identified as being neurotic fears. Why? Because they aren't a sort of ordinary constructive response to what's going on that causes one to change one's behavior and actions in order to avoid that. They are instead something that makes one neurotic, makes one sort of cycle that around in one's own mind and create problems. So we're going to kind of look at, I mean, we will touch on both of these as we already have, but throughout the rest of this evening, but I guess we're mostly looking at the neurotic fears. And of course, Buddhism would enlarge this to include not just those things that can be clinically diagnosed by a Western psychiatrist or psychologist, those things that are technically called phobias or what have you, but nonetheless, anything that becomes problematic for us, that doesn't allow us to move with that, through that, use that in our spiritual path. So we can see fear at many different levels within that, but what the Buddha would call neurotic fear, I think, would be a much bigger category than what Western psychology might call a neurotic fear. And of course, when we get into the deeper understanding of fear, as I was alluding to earlier, we see that actually so much of our fear is revolving around this sort of tight sense of a self and person that is inducing all of this, that those at higher levels of realization don't have that fear because there's no longer any sort of target for that. There's no longer any object that could be the the thing that is harmed by that future pain or what have you. There'd be no experience of that whatsoever. So in terms of this idea of uncertainty that's mentioned here too, though, I want to talk a little bit about that, especially because I think this is another component that is really working our minds right now, is the uncertainty that we see in our world. Um, so again, this is what I just alluded to. We're mainly talking about unwholesome fear, since we can learn a lot from this type of fear, but the wholesome fear will be discussed as part of this. I thought I put in there about the uncertainty. I'll talk about uncertainty later. Sorry. I just got it in my mind that the slides were in a slightly different order. So let's look at the Buddhist psychology view of where all this comes from, because what I've talked about so far is in a very general way in terms of some future anticipation of pain, problems, some change in the status quo that comes into our sphere of experience, and then it causes us to maybe respond effectively or to become a bit neurotic about it. But in Buddhist terms, the elements of this process of unwholesome fear arising can be seen in terms of these three primary distorted states of mind, which, of course, as you know, are also called the three poisons. So the three poisons, I think all of you are familiar with these, but we have attachment or desire, it's sometimes called, aversion or anger. Aversion is kind of the more milder forms of that, perhaps. We can see that within the first two, at least, there are certainly different gradations of all of this, because attachment or desire could become as problematic as addiction, addictive behavior and thinking. And aversion or anger could become all the way up through rage and hatred, really powerful states of mind. But these are the two main sort of reactions that are going on in regard to what we're experiencing. At the root of those is ignorance or confusion. And we'll talk about this a bit tonight. I mentioned the other night that I wouldn't be getting into emptiness so much, but we may touch on that again tonight in a very minor way with this ignorance or confusion that is at the root of all of these. So how are the three poisons involved in the arising of fear? Well, we're all starting from a place of attachment with a fundamental desire that wants things to be exactly how we like them to be. This, once more, is what was alluded to earlier of kind of the status quo, our comfort zone. Venerable Rubino, I actually did have lunch with her recently. She's here in Santa Fe, of course, kind of making this her home base while the pandemic's going on, at least for the time being, until she can travel again. And she says, and you've probably heard this from in one of her teachings before, but she says, everyone always asks, why do bad things happen to people? Why do bad things happen to me? But no one ever asks, well, why do good things happen to me? And that's because the fundamental assumption is that good things are supposed to happen to us, is that things are supposed to go our way. So I'm highlighting attachment as sort of the main one that this process begins from to some degree. Of course, ignorance is the underlying one, but attachment is our default mode. We live our lives sort of with a constant craving and desire for what we need for our happiness and well-being. And so this is how we live our lives. In fact, when the Buddha taught the Sutra on the Four Noble Truths, his most core teaching, his very first teaching, He highlighted desire and attachment as the main cause of our suffering when he delineated the second truth. The first truth, of course, being dukkha, this dissatisfactory state that we're all involved in. The second truth being, why are we in that? Well, of course, we're in that because of our karma, but where does our karma come from? Our states of mind. And what is the most direct state of mind that causes us to develop the karma by which we experience various things in our lives? Desire, attachment. We're constantly craving, wanting, seeking to satisfy this self. This is sort of, again, our default mode, where we're coming from. So if that's how we live our lives, is that that's how we're looking at everything that we experience, that we want things to be the way we like them to be. Well, then, of course, as Venerable Rabina says, we never ask, well, why is it the way that I want it to be? We take that for granted, that that's the way that we want it to be. So Venerable Rabina, a quote from her talk again. She says, attachment is the constant emotional hunger to get only the nice things, only the things that I want. Attachment is desperate for everything to be nice, comfortable, unthreatening. Right? Does this sound familiar? I like using Venerable Rabina's words because she was my first FPMT teacher way back in 1996. And, I just love her way of presenting the Dharma. And I can't always do it as skillful as her if I ever can. She has her own way, of course, of approaching things. But this is so true. This is where we work from every day. It's there all the time, she says, underpinning everything, deep in our bones. And even more than that, it assumes that I deserve only the nice things. Such hubris. As she says, I mean, this is our, our assumption, is that we deserve the best things, that that's what we should be getting every single day of our lives. And of course, this attachment manifests in the Dharma in terms of what are called the 8 worldly concerns, or 8 worldly dharmas, which are set out in 4 pairs. These are the ways that our attachment manifests. Let me go through these somewhat quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on them tonight, but they are important to be aware of, and see how much these types of attachment are playing a role in our assumptions about how we live our lives, and therefore the fears that arise on the basis of any of that being threatened. So these pairs that are set out are, first, the attachment to having material gain. This is the first one. Having things, continuing to hold on to one's things. And the attachment, we can say, to not having material loss, or the assumption that we shouldn't be losing things. Again, we think that it is our right, to have the material things that we have, the resources and so on. And anyone threatening to take that away, we are immediately bent out of shape by that, or anything that is threatening to take that away, which again is where a lot of our fear comes from. Why? Because we have the attachment as our default mode. I mean, this is something I think I don't know if I mentioned this on Wednesday night or not, but attachment is essentially, because it's this presumed way of going about our lives, anything that gets in the way of that attachment causes us to have the next reaction that we're going to go into after attachment, which is the aversion, the anger. As many teachers have said, anger is what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants. So we're already getting a flavor of that in terms of the 8 worldly concerns, because what we want every day is to have that security of our resources, our wealth, everything taken care of, and even get more of it. Hand me more, put more in my bank account, do everything possible to take care of me. We love to have gain. Who doesn't like going to their mailbox and getting a unexpected check or something? But then if we get a bill that we weren't expecting, went to the doctor and we thought our insurance covered it, and suddenly we've got $400 we have to pay, and we're going, oh my God, where am I going to get that from? So we always have this strong aversion because we think it's all supposed to go in our favor. That is our default mode that's involved in these 8 worldly concerns. So having gone through that one, I won't go through the other ones in quite as much detail. The third and the fourth, this pair, have to do with comfort, pleasure. We think that everything is supposed to go well, that we're supposed to have a comfortable flight when we get on the airlines, that we're supposed to have, a pleasurable experience with our friends, that everything is supposed to go smoothly. We don't like it when it's uncomfortable, when we have to experience any pain. We get quite bent out of shape at that. And again, fear is one of the things that alerts us to that things could be going south, that we're not going to get what we want. Then we have attachment to receiving praise and to not receiving criticism. When somebody opens their mouth, they say, "Oh, you did a really good job, but let me give you a few pointers," and you kind of want to go, "Wow, what are you talking about? Get out of my face." You know, we do, we really like people to say good things about us, and we don't like to have our faults pointed out. What is the old thing about, if 10 people all talk about you and 9 of them praise you and one of them says something bad, who do you listen to? You go right to that 10th person and you say, "What are you talking about? I'm not that way at all," and get really defensive. That's because you're attached to a view of yourself as worthy, and you should be receiving praise everywhere you go. People should be loving you and, thinking well of you. And that leads us on to the last pair, which is the attachment to having a good reputation and to not having a bad reputation. That we really think that people should think well of us, and even in our families, our society, our workplace, whatever. Having a bad reputation would be just, anathema. We would not want to experience it in the least. So again, fear is already can be seen as how it is the response that we have when attachment gets threatened, when the status quo gets threatened, when our desire for gain, comfort, praise, good reputation gets threatened. Here's where I go into uncertainty. And of course, in these 8 worldly concerns, as it says here, we're trying to find something secure and certain that we can rely upon. But this is fundamentally flawed since things in our conditioned lives are uncertain. This was mentioned earlier in one of the slides, right? That uncertainty plays a part in this. I found it quite interesting that uncertainty in one presentation of sort of the faults of our conditioned existence, the very first one is the fault of uncertainty. The Buddha said that the very nature of our existence is that things change. They cannot be relied upon to be certain and unfailing. I mentioned this earlier as one of the sort of default modes that we have, right? That every day is supposed to be going our way, everything is supposed to be fantastic, but things are in the very nature of changing, sometimes in very drastic ways. In one of Pema Chodron's talks, she cites a Time magazine article. I couldn't find the actual article. I think it'd be interesting to read. It was about fear. And researchers found that most people have a greater fear of uncertainty than even of their own physical pain. I mean, I do find that kind of interesting, in terms of a lot of people's response to the pandemic. There have been a lot more people that have been very vehement about not wanting the uncertainty. They want things to go back to the certainty they had before all of this, right? Where we knew that everything was going to be the way we wanted it to be. We wouldn't have to stand in line out in front of a grocery store, and we wouldn't be kept from going to work, or we wouldn't, whatever, all the various things that are indicative of the uncertainty of the times that we're living in. Everyone wants to go back to being certain. And sometimes they are pushing for that, to go back to that place of certainty, even at the risk of lives, even at the risk of their own physical pain. Why? Because we crave that. We crave having things being determined, that we know what's going to occur. I mean, this is why big events in life, like what happened on 9/11, some 19 years ago, these are so problematic for people generally, and why they cause so much stress is because we like to think things are moving along in a very expected way. And then when we have something occur, like the pandemic or like 9/11 or any other big events in our personal lives even, those shift things drastically. And that's when fear often comes up, is because we don't like uncertainty. I mean, I have to admit from my own perspective in terms of how I'm planning my life right now that it's really frustrating to kind of have everything be uncertain. I don't know exactly what's going on, in 2021. I mean, I have a pretty good idea in terms of how I have it on paper for the rest of this year, but I don't even really know for sure what's going to happen with that because things could change. And this has really upset the apple cart for a lot of people. People, have this expectation that it's all just going to keep humming along. Well, wake up, folks. We're dealing with a world that is not cast in stone like that. And for us to expect that is really, really against the grain. It's not in line with truth at all. Now, again, we might have lived most of our lives where we felt like we could do that. Well, we've been very fortunate. I guess we've had really good karma to be able to continue to have things go our way. Let's go through just the rest of this section on uncertainty and this where does fear come from. Well, actually, I don't know if we're going to be able to get through all of that. We're going to take a break in a couple minutes, but let's see how far we get before the break. So again, we crave having some certitude in our lives, wanting everything to stay put in the way that we have come to desire it to be. Venerable Rabina says in her teaching, where she alluded to this, mixed in with this is the assumption that the nice things shouldn't change. They won't change. How dare they change, right? We just can't stand the thought of those nice things, our comfort zone, being disturbed. So we add another layer of nonsense, another fantasy. We believe, we assume that the status quo is permanent, unchanging. So again, these are many of the things I've already talked about, but it's just reiterating it through Venerable Rabina's words, that this is what causes us to have such consternation. Of course, then this is the second step in this. Attachment was our default mode, where we're thinking from that place. Then, as it said here, a threat, whether real or imagined, just like Freud said, we can have some things that are real fear, or you might have some things that might even be imagined. It might not be based in reality. Some threat to that sense of security appears, and we react with aversion to the possibility that we might lose that and experience something painful or difficult. Right? This is the process that we all went through in terms of COVID-19. I'm sure every one of you went through it to some degree. To see that there's the status quo is no longer something we can rely upon. Things are going to change. Things are going to be very different, and we don't even know what they were going to be. At that time we had a lot of uncertainty. So that aversion or anger arises on the basis of that threat. So, as Venerable Rabina says, the millisecond attachment doesn't get what it wants, and it certainly doesn't want coronavirus or anything to do with it. Aversion arises, and depending on our personality, that can manifest as anger, upset, irritation, even despair and depression. These mindsets of despair, depression. I think that a lot of people went through that initially too, and there probably are some people, unfortunately, that are still going through that mindset. But that is a mindset that is rooted in this aversion energy. It's a very interesting one because it gets kind of turned in on oneself. It doesn't become outwardly manifest, but that depression and despair puts the dark cloud within ourselves and makes what we are experiencing into a personal event that is very difficult for people to go through because they become enveloped in that. When it becomes manifest as anger and what have you, they're still, of course, consumed by that delusion, but it's at least got an external bent to it. When it kind of goes within, it can become very problematic for people. So this is how aversion energy manifests. Something comes in and threatens that status quo. Attachment doesn't get what it wants. And guess what? We have this aversion energy. Yeah. This aversion that can manifest, as Venerable Rabina says, in a variety of ways. And every one of us has perhaps our own habits and patterns that will appear at that time. Think back again to what you went through when all this first started. Then the third thing, of course, that's involved, the third delusion, which is the root of the other two, is ignorance or confusion, which also plays this fundamental role, though, and this can be seen more specifically with regard to the one main fact of existence about which we have confusion. We have a lot of different levels of ignorance. It plays a fundamental role, and that's primarily in regard to the confusion that we have about ourselves and the nature of reality. At the root of all our delusions is what we call this term that's called self-grasping. The ignorance that mistakenly holds the I, this self that you are so familiar with, that you have a strong awareness of, to exist independently, inherently, from its own side, which is in contrast to how it actually exists. It exists dependently, non-inherently. It relies upon factors outside of itself. You know, all of this is the nature of how things actually exist, but we are clinging to things existing in that fictitious way. And of course, the core one, the main one, is our grasping at this sense of I, this person that we adhere to so tightly. And of course, we've had a sense of person. The Buddha says, because our consciousness, our awareness is continuous, always arising from previous moments of consciousness. It's gone back without any beginning. We've always had a sense of a self when we were a snail or a bee or a hell being or whatever being we were. We always had some sense of a self on the basis of the components of our being, the consciousness, and of course the physical form that we took in various existences. That simply thinking of that as a self isn't the problem. It's thinking of it as a real self, as a self that has some sort of independent status. And this calls for really deep investigation into looking at this sense of person that we elevate to a degree to where then that becomes what compels us to engage in the other two afflictions. That compels us to have this thought process of thinking that we need what we want for that self every day, that attachment, that desire that craves all of that and wants everything lined up perfectly so that we can satisfy that self. And that aversion or anger energy that arises when the self doesn't get what it wants, when this sense of a self that is at the root of all of this feels threatened and is confronted with things that are in opposition to what it wants. But we live from the vantage point of wanting to satisfy that self, believing in that self to such a large degree. Of course, the Buddha, as I was alluding to earlier when I said that the self exists dependently, said that the I, the self, is just a dependent arising. It arises on the basis of various factors, including all the causes and conditions that led to it. It arises on the basis of its parts, which in a very kind of lump way would be our mind and our body. There are many parts to each of those. Nonetheless, this is how we kind of have an arising of a sense of a whole, an I, on the basis of these parts. But then when we investigate that deeper, we come to see that this sense of an I that we have is really just a thought in relation to this stuff. That there's nothing more that we can find that's sort of substantially there that is the I, that is this sense of a self that we cling to so tightly. So this is kind of like, again, the wisdom of emptiness that we'll allude to a little bit later as well, that pulls the rug out from underneath this strong sense of a self, a person from which all of this is occurring. So in relation to fear, of course, we have that initial attachment that says things have to be the way I want them to be. On the basis of that, something threatens that, and we have the anger or the aversion energy. But behind the curtain is this strong adherence to the self that all this is revolving around. This strong sense of wanting that self to get what it wants, and then to protect that self when it's threatened in terms of not getting what it wants. So this is the operation of this. Let me go back to the slides, but before we take a break and just give you one more quote, I think, from Venerable Rabina. She says, so where does fear fit into all of this? Interestingly, it has no status of its own in the list of neurotic states of mind that I mentioned earlier among the 51, the ones that are afflictive states. It's not listed there. Simply because fear is the flavor, she says, the character, the energy, the very nature of all of them. They're rooted in fear. They are the voices of the main delusion, the main fantasy, the primordial grasping at a separate, concrete, set in stone me. The Buddha even said this in the Dhammapada, which we don't use quite as much in the Tibetan tradition, but it's a wonderful set of verses that come from the Pali Canon. He said, selfish attachment brings suffering. Selfish attachment brings fear. Be detached and you will be free from suffering and fear. And of course, this is alluding to, that deeper level of fearlessness that one can experience when one lets go of that strong sense of I that we are clinging to. When we realize the emptiness of that, the lack of that, all of that can be let go and eventually completely eliminated from the mind. But initially we have to see that this is the process by which fear is arising. And I like how she pointed this out. I have to say she added this dimension to it that I didn't have in my earlier teachings, because I was just kind of poking around with kind of saying it comes from all three and giving some structure to it. But I wasn't really pointing to this idea that it's the very flavor of them, which is really quite true if we analyze. We see that this is the fundamental place that we're coming from. Holding on to this strong sense of self comes from some sort of fear of that not being there, of losing that, of any threat to that. And so then we develop the attachment that wants to protect that and make sure that that keeps going, humming along, being taken care of, and the aversion whenever that is threatened. That fear is the very flavor of that strong grasping at an eye that is underneath all of our delusions, our jealousy and our pride and everything else, as well as, of course, the two other root ones that are the the flavor of the ones that are rooted off of them. But everything boils down to that fundamental fear that we're working from. All right, so I have about 8:09 here. Let's take, if it's okay with everyone, just have maybe just 8:15 again, and that way I have a little bit more time. That'll give everybody about 5-6 minutes to at least get up and stretch if you need to use the restroom, what have you. So I'll be back at 8:15, so hang on. So this idea again of uh, different reactions, effects that fear might have on us. We just started talking about this. So um, those two are, maybe a lot of things fit into that category: the hyperactivity and then the paralysis. Does anyone want to share anything from your own experience in terms of what occurred for you? You've been recently dealing with fear, or another time in your life when you were dealing with fear? Anyone?
I did a lot of obsessive cleaning of unnecessary things like gutters, which I assume is the hyperactivity.
Yeah, yeah. I think so, Catherine. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Heather, did you want to share something too? Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, my husband died very unexpectedly in March, and
Yeah, I was so sorry to hear that news.
I
Yeah.
remember he said thank you. And it it still causes me a great fear, but the most immediate reaction, because of the pandemic, and I'd been planning to live in Italy. I was ended up staying with my brother and then with my parents, and I had this. What is the real knowledge that everybody I love will die if I don't die first, in this very sort of real way that was just terrifying, and this very like physical pain that I felt. And I in hindsight I could see that I was just scrambling. One of the things that Chad he tied up almost everything and left me in a very good position to be able to deal with like the management of what you have to do when somebody dies. But there was something he didn't do that caused is still causing me a lot of hassle, for better words. So I found myself, I have to have all my accounts in order. I have to have this in order. I can't put anybody through this. I can't put my family through anything. And so it was a hyperactivity in this way of almost just trying to take control of everything, telling my father he had to do more crosswords so that his mind didn't degenerate. And I mean, just this real kind of trying to grasping at control for everything around me, to try to control this like very real sort of vulnerability that this is what will happen if I don't die first. Everybody I love will, so it's a very, very real thing. Over time, I feel like I've managed to the opportunity to your talk the other night in how you see things is that it's forced me to take refuge in a very, very real, tangible way that is, you know, transformative already. And I can see that, but that's a very real fear. A lot of my neuroses I can tend to, I'm just obsessing, but this feels, it's something that's the biggest thing that I've encountered in my life.
Well, what a lesson that has given you, but what a hard one to,
Yeah,
to receive nonetheless. So yeah, my
right.
heart goes out to you, but it's good to hear though that again, it's alerted you to some certain things, and you can see where maybe sometimes it might go a little too far, or you might feel like I need to be pulling that back a bit and more aware of that, conscious of that.
Right.
Of course, the whole thing of death, death is such a huge issue. I mentioned it on Wednesday night when we talked about transforming our problems and what have you. That's a reality that we all have to face. And the awareness of it can't come too soon in some ways, because it is so important on our spiritual path in terms of making good use of this life and making sure that we do everything that we can while we still have this life. And we don't know how long we're going to have this life. That's one of the core teachings, of course, on death in the Buddhist tradition, that uncertainty. So even when we see it happening in the way that you had to experience, where all of a sudden everything's very, very different, very much changed. It's good to make use of all of that again, to make sure that we don't miss the lesson there, that we don't go back to ways of assuming things, because it's very easy over time. You're still, very, very fresh involved in, the grieving process and everything that has unfolded for you and is continuing to unfold for you. But from my own experience of having lost my first partner back in 1992, that's a long time ago. It's it isn't as fresh, and it doesn't have the kind of immediacy to it that when you're going through that. And so it's important. I just applaud your, taking advantage of what you're going through to use it in that way. Thank you for sharing that, both of you. I mean, it really does help to give some flavor to what we're talking about here, because we all know this from our experiences, and we all don't have similar experiences, but we have similar ways of responding, similar ways of kind of trying to cope with the fears that we have. Thank you. Let's go back then to the slides and continue this exploration of kind of the effects of fear, because I think it is important that we do take some cognizance of that, make sure that we're aware of that. But neither of those patterns, nor any other patterns that we have that divert our attention away from fear, allow us to make use of it. And this is, of course, the whole point. And what I was seeing myself go through initially around coronavirus was a little, chaotic and doing things. And I was going, no, I need to be present with this. I mean, it didn't last very long, my sort of going astray, but it was obvious that if I didn't sort of sit with what was going on and open up my heart to the reality of what was going on, I was going to miss a very valuable lesson from what's transpiring in our world right now. So those patterns, those effects block us from seeing what it's all about and from working with fear. So I wanted to introduce those and kind of talk about them briefly. There's not much more that I'm going to say in this one more slide, I think. However, if we work with our fear, then even what we usually call unwholesome or irrational fear can also be used in our spiritual path. Of course, the wholesome fear, those sorts of things are, a part and parcel of the lam rim. When things are pointed out about trepidation about future lives or experiences in one's life in the future and all this, those are, a necessary part of the path, and they're obviously falling into that category. But even what we call our unwholesome fears, the irrational fears that we have, can also be used in the spiritual path because they're still rooted in similar concepts, rooted in delusions. So let's go into how do we work with fear. As I warned you earlier, you're going to see some of the same things here that we talked about on Wednesday night, but that's okay. Again, we'll see them presented a little bit differently because I'm actually going to use the words of His Holiness to look at those. But I see it as 3 steps now. Again, where am I getting this from? Oh, just things that I've read and kind of a way of approaching it. Another teacher might give other things on it. As I said, there's not a lot in Buddhism about fear, though obviously contemporary Buddhist publications like Tricycle, like Thich Nhat Hanh's book on fear that's going to be quoted here in a moment. There are some resources out there that have tried to work with fear because they see it as such a huge thing in our culture. What Thich Nhat Hanh says is the first step for dealing with fear is to invite it in. We even had that title of Chogyam Trungpa's book, Smile at Fear. It's kind of like, oh, my old friend fear is here. Let's see what fear has to teach me today. And then assess what we are fearing and why. This is a second process that we're going to go into a little bit, is to get at what is it that's really going on. Maybe deconstruct that fear to see, is it something wholesome, something unwholesome, something we can do something about, something we can't do something about. And then thirdly, apply our understanding of Buddhist principles to transform our fear into the path. This is similar to what we saw again on Wednesday. But as I said, I'm going to approach it just a little bit differently, using His Holiness's words as a structure. So the first part of looking at our fear, Thich Nhat Hanh says, is just inviting it into our awareness without any judgment. We just acknowledge gently that it is there. This brings a lot of relief already. I have to say that when I go back to the whole idea of what was transpiring for me back when this coronavirus pandemic really hit in the US and the reality came home, because I think all of us, even though deep inside we weren't believing what was being said from the White House and what have you, we've got 15 cases, there'll be none, in a matter of days. well, we kind of didn't know for sure what was really going to happen, right? And so when it started to unfold, there was something once more about the initial reaction might be, oh, I just need to kind of keep myself busy, clean the gutters or whatever, do something that's going to kind of distract me and not make me look at that, because I don't really want to look at that. I don't really want to be confronted with that. And then maybe once we get through all of that, we can actually sit down with it and invite it in and say, wow, what does this have to teach me? What is this all about? Is this really something that I want to reject and push out of my life? Or it's part and parcel of a full existence? You know, having things that confront us is a necessary part of our path, as we saw on Wednesday night, right? That we need those things in our lives. Otherwise, I mean, if we live our lives free of any fear, if you're sort of taken care of, if you can imagine this type of situation, it might even sound like a nightmare to some of us, but where you're taken care of from the moment you are born till the moment you die by others, having your needs met. You never have to worry about working. You never have to worry about, getting to the doctor. Everything's managed for you. It's all taken care of. You're still going to have to die. You're still going to have to age and deal with some of those realities. But, if you're sort of kept from experiencing the things that confront the status quo, that get in the way of our expectation that things are going to go along, well, then are we really going to learn any lessons? As I mentioned earlier, we learn when we're outside our comfort zone. We actually develop more ability when we get outside of that place that feels good to be in. And so what I was going through, certainly when the coronavirus epidemic hit here in the US, was initially some of that reaction, but then kind of going, okay, it feels kind of good to be with this fear, actually, because this fear is embracing the totality of my life, embracing the reality that things don't always go the way I want them to, and that my life is going to be affected in ways that have become manageable. It's not like I'm, dealing with horrific problems in my life right now, unlike many people in the country or in the world who have very, very different situations than I do. But, it's manageable. It's something that if I could open up to, I could actually find a way to work with it. So this is the very first step, is kind of inviting it in, to kind of roll out the red carpet and say, here's my fear. And then, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, then once our fear has calmed down, we can embrace it tenderly and look deeply into its roots, its sources. Understanding the origins of our anxieties and fears will help us let go of them, or I would even include, or learn from them, to actually figure out what it is that fear has to teach us at that time. This is kind of moving into, as it says at the top of this slide, to assess what we are fearing and why. This is that investigative process, which again is so central to so much of what we work with in Buddhism. We don't just allow things to come in and, settle down. We want to actually learn from them, look at them, pick them apart, dissect them, understand them, because that's how we're actually going to make some changes. So if you, this is again His Holiness, he was talking in his book, A Policy of Kindness. If you have fear of some pain or suffering, you should examine first whether there is anything you can do about it. If you can, there is no need to worry about it. If you cannot do anything, then there is also no need to worry. This sounds familiar, right? Because this is what we were looking at on Wednesday night as well. And this is, of course, that famous verse that His Holiness goes to, that many of us go to very frequently, that comes from chapter 6 of Master Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Verse 10 says, why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? Or we could use, why be fearful about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being fearful about something if it cannot be remedied? So again, when we talk about the first part of this, as we did on Wednesday, if that is where the fear becomes more wholesome, right? It's something that is alerting you to something that could be changed to avoid that future pain or difficulty. Nothing wrong with that. The Buddha doesn't want us to suffer needlessly. If there are things we can change in our lives that will avert the pain and difficulty and problems and suffering that we would have to experience had we not done that, then do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. That's sort of part of our fundamental makeup. That is the starting point for all of what the Buddha taught. The Buddha sees us all as essentially wanting not to suffer, wanting to be happy. That's the starting point. How we go about doing that, of course, is something we have to examine, and that's what the Buddha's teachings are there to help us to find the true causes of happiness and to avoid anything that brings about any suffering or difficulty in its entirety. It's a path to happiness, to ultimate well-being. So, acknowledging that that is your default, very basic default mode, do what you can to remedy situations that can be remedied. So then your fear doesn't really serve a purpose, right? If you get fearful because something is threatening a particular part of your life, well, no, you just say, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, I'm going to get to work, I'm going to do what needs to be done, and I'm going to make the best out of the situation, and maybe even make it into something better. I mean, I do have to find that, I already had been doing some online teachings prior to all of this, but, I've been playing with the idea of doing more online teachings, and it's actually been a really interesting experience to open up to doing everything online. I do nothing in person anymore right now. I don't know what the future looks like. Hopefully that'll return at some point. But, it gives me a whole nother avenue of exploration and a different way of working with it. And any fears I might have had about, well, what happens to all the centers I'm going to visit, and is it really going to happen, and blah, 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 blah. I mean, not that I had tons of that, but, this is an example of something I can do something about. Just embrace the reality of what I'm confronted with and recognize that I can actually change things myself so that the situation becomes more manageable. On the other hand, when we go back to that verse and we look at the second part of it, there are certainly some things that we can't remedy about coronavirus. You can't, as I mentioned the other night, you can't, like, snap your fingers or click your shoes together 3 times like Dorothy did and, end up in some other world, where you don't have those problems any longer, where coronavirus doesn't exist and where everyone is doing what they did before all of this. This just is impossible to do, right? So why be unhappy? Why be dejected? Why be fearful if it's something that we cannot actually remedy? So in terms of coronavirus too, I mean, the things that you can do something about, protecting yourself through wearing a face covering, through social distancing, through physical distancing, I should call it. I really don't like the term social distancing, but anyway, um, do what you can to protect yourself, have a healthy regard for the reality of this virus and how it is transmitted, but then go about your life being joyful that you're still here, able to do what you can with this life to make it of use and benefit to yourself and others. So this is a really important part of the process, is to really examine that fear and see what is going on. What is it that I'm fearful of? Something I can do something about, and maybe some elements I can do something about, or is it a situation that I really can't change? And then, of course, to apply our understanding of Buddhist principles. Of course, part of that previous one too, I didn't go into it so much, but it would be worthwhile, and I would encourage you, based on what I've gone through tonight in terms of where fear comes from, is to see what your underlying assumptions are for why you're having such a strong fearful reaction to what's going on. See how your attachment is playing a role, how your anger and aversion energy is playing a role, and if you can, even investigate how your ignorance is playing a role. And if you become cognizant of everything that is involved in causing that fear to arise, then you go on to the next step and you can really do what you can to work on, you know, undermining that, making sure that we do what we can to change our minds and to use everything in a very positive way, very similar to what we talked about the other night. So as I said, I'm going to use um, some of His Holiness's teachings, but here I'm starting with another little bit from the book on fear that Thich Nhat Hanh wrote. He says, if you can look deeply into your fear and have a clear vision of it, then you can really live a life that is worthwhile. Now, he didn't go on to allude everything that I'm going to be presenting, that is part of the Lam Rim and what His Holiness generally presents. But I think he's meaning the same thing. It's like you can actually do something really positive with a deeper investigation of fear. So, since Dharma is essentially defined as that which holds or protects from suffering, that's the literal translation of this word Dharma, we need to take heartfelt refuge in the Buddha's teachings whenever we feel fear. And of course, this is what I mentioned the other night, right? When you have problems, difficulties, fearful situations, you need to really examine, where is my refuge? What is it that I am putting my refuge in? If we're putting all of our refuge, as I mentioned on Wednesday night, into the external situation, we're needing the external situation to be everything we want it to be in order for us to feel any measure of happiness, well-being, contentment. Well, this is a very good lesson in this right now, what we're going through, because it's showing that we don't have much control over the external world at all. As I said, there's no place on the planet other than these very remote areas that you're probably not going to be very happy living in, where you can completely get away from this. It's happening everywhere. I mean, I found it kind of interesting. An article I came across on the internet was about 10 places in the world where people over 50 from the United States, Americans over 50, can go fairly easily and, transplant there, become an expatriate there. And I'm like going, but why are they advertising that now? I mean, sure, America's not doing a very good job, it seems, in handling this virus, but anywhere you go, you're going to be dealing with that reality. So this is, again, something that is just showing that where is our refuge at the time when things go askew, when we have things that would induce fear. The fear is coming from a place of not having a grounding in our refuge. Because if we really look at the Dharma and try to apply it at that time, we see that because fear is arising from things that can be counteracted by Dharma, well then the bigger action at that time that we should be engaging in is using our Dharma knowledge, using our refuge in the Dharma to counteract all of that, to disentangle all of that. To see how much my attachment to things needing to be the way I like them to be is causing me to have such consternation and fear. I have to admit, from my side, I'm very much a homebody when it comes down to it. I love traveling up to the Denver area and seeing all of you and all my other Dharma friends around the U.S. in particular, as well as other parts of the world that I've traveled to. But I really like being home too. I don't know, maybe that's my Taurus in me, but nonetheless, this has still been challenging because I'm almost home a little too much now. It would be nice to get on a plane every now and then, or even at least go to a cafe or do something, a little different. Haven't done even so much of that, in these weeks and months. So every one of us finds these things that are challenging, but we have to look at it again as, where's my refuge now? I can't change the external situation. I can't change what it is that is going on. I can change my mind though. I can work with my mind. I can find ways to, as many people posted right after all this started, when everybody was on lockdown, or most people on lockdown and kind of at home, that many Buddhist practitioners welcome that opportunity to kind of shut off everything outside and to go inside. And maybe some of you were fortunate enough to have, some downtime where you weren't working and you could actually use it as more or less a retreat. This is, again, a reframing of that so that we see that our real refuge at that time is our inner refuge. It's not in the external world. It's not in those things outside of ourselves. So that's kind of a preliminary step in this. And again, recall that even in the teachings on refuge and that are in the Lamrim, which is again in the small scope, that the two causes of refuge, the first one is fear. I mean, you do have to have some sort of healthy fear or dread of existence and the future rebirths that could be unfavorable, and all the things that the Buddha teaches us that we should have a healthy regard for, because otherwise we could end up falling into those patterns of suffering again. The second element, of course, of our refuge is the confidence that the three jewels, and especially the Dharma. I mean, the Buddha can't sweep down from Buddhaville and, take us up to Buddhaville and hang out with all the other Buddhas at the Buddha bar with him. That's just not going to happen. Where is our real refuge? Our real refuge is in the Dharma, in the teachings that the Buddha gave us that are the real medicine that we need to take. This is what will protect us from fear to the greatest level, because we see that whatever we're experiencing in the world, be it something that is changeable or something that is not changeable, whether it be something that is very serious or whether it's just slight, all of this is part and parcel of what the Buddha describes as our experience in samsara, our experience in cyclic existence. So we have to have, again, that understanding that our real refuge is in the face of experiencing anything fearful. We renew our confidence that the Dharma is the solution to all of this. And again, and hopefully all of you were effective in using that when everything began, as well as dealing with other things in your life, such as, what you mentioned, Heather, and with your husband and so on. I mean, it's good to have the Dharma as the tool that we use at that time. And there are a number of tools within Dharma that can be used. And that's what we're going to go into in the remainder of this, is some of the other things that we can channel that fearful experience into, so that we make sure that we use that very well. But it begins with some confidence in the Dharma especially, all three jewels, but especially the Dharma, that we can gain something from using the Buddha's teachings at that time. So the way I've divided this up, the first three look very familiar because we used them the other night, but these are actually kind of the way that His Holiness presented his answer to a question. He was actually asked the question, how can one work with deep fears most effectively? I found this on the internet, and this is the way that he went about giving his responses, was to deal with these three things. And then I'm adding in here tantric methods because I think Tantra also has some ability to help us to confront and work with fear. So one way to work with, actually maybe this was from a policy of kindness. Actually, that's true. I found this on the internet, and then I found out that it was from a policy of kindness, and so I'm giving the reference to that here. I don't recall the exact page numbers, but anyway, he says, one way to work with deep fears is to think that the fear comes as a result of your own actions in the past. And this is once more that karmic understanding that what we are experiencing always is a product of what we've done in the past. Those feelings that arise, the unpleasantness of having to confront things that are threatening our comfort, our security, and so on, all of that is a product of our own past actions. And so fear itself is a karmic creation. Usually when something bad happens, we say, oh, very unlucky. And when something good happens, we say, oh, very lucky. Actually, these two words, lucky and unlucky, are simply insufficient. In terms of karma, they aren't the picture at all, really. I mean, this is the way the world looks at it. Oh, you have such good fortune. You're very lucky. Well, no, everything is a karmic creation. So there must be some reason, His Holiness says. Because of a reason, a certain time became lucky or unlucky, but usually we do not go beyond lucky or unlucky. The reason, according to the Buddhist explanation, is our past karma, our actions. So I've kind of lumped together these two, karma and renunciation, because when we have things coming into our lives, that is sort of the first understanding that we can have, is that this is a karmic creation. I mentioned this again on Wednesday as well. And with things that are inducing fear, it's no different. And even the fear itself is its own sort of karmic creation, because it's a mental state that we've habituated ourselves to, that then arises on the basis of certain causes and conditions. And we can look at that as a karmic creation. Karma is not a static process. It's not cast in stone. Now, there are certain karmic creations, effects that we have to experience that are very, very hard to change once the effect has come into fruition. As soon as, just like, I mean, if we look at the fires that are going on in Colorado, here in New Mexico, and, a lot of parts of the West, especially California, very, very hard once the fire started to extinguish it, and to control it and what have you, especially when you have other things feeding it. But sometimes things can be done, and over time fires eventually do get extinguished. We don't have fires that have been going on for eternity, other than maybe in the core of the planet or something. But what I'm talking about here are, again, these things that arise, and they have causes and conditions, and then eventually the causes and conditions change. But that's because everything is a product of our karma. Yes, there are physical things going on as well that cause fires to go out of control, but they are karmic creations because they are affecting the lives of beings. So anything that we see that induces any sense of fear, even that fear itself, we can see as arising from causes and conditions. Therefore, something that we can work with in terms of changing it. And as I said, we might not be able to change it in the moment, but we can change the patterns that got us into that. If we look at coronavirus, I mean, I don't know. I've done some thinking about this, and I think certainly, the lessons that many of us can learn, perhaps, are this whole idea of not being so concerned about the effects of our delusions in our world. On animals, on the planet. I mean, climate change is also pointing us in the direction of that lesson, to kind of see that if we sort of continue to stay on this track of doing whatever we need to do to just keep invading on the, encroaching upon the environment that beings live in and what have you, these viruses come from other beings and from them being introduced into humans through close contact with them that might not be happening if we weren't following patterns of attachment and all the things that need to satisfy our attachment. So we can begin to look at it, each of us individually, in terms of how that plays out and what sorts of mental energy are creating the situations that are so fearful for us, are so difficult for us. Of course, renunciation I put with that because, again, that's the goal of a lot of this thinking, is to recognize that we are in an unsatisfactory, sort of situation. Samsara is being under the control of our karma and afflictions. And as long as that's the case, we're going to continue to experience the variety of sufferings. I have to say that actually, whoops, let me take it off screen here, that actually what I've noticed in terms of my own working with coronavirus and all this is that renunciation is one of my go-to teachings, because it's just where I'm at in terms of my own spiritual development. It really helps to look at what's going on to get this conclusion that this is not such a great place to be. We delude ourselves into thinking because everything was going along and humming along fine and whatever, always having the things that we need, never being challenged and getting the food that we want, or whatever the case might be, never feeling a right around the corner sort of physical threat to our health or what have you, that we can sort of be blind to that reality. And samsara, the state of existence that we're in under the control of these factors, is not, a cakewalk. It's not a jog in the park or something. It is an undesirable situation that we ourselves are caught in and that others are caught in. And if we can take that initial renunciation and then move that into connection with others, that's what we're going to get into next. But that's the starting point, though, is to see your own suffering and to be aware of it and to develop some sense of wanting to emerge from that, as I mentioned the other night. Now, when we start hearing about karma and all this stuff, I'm throwing this in there. Maybe, I'll just go through this really quickly, because I know we all struggle with teachings on karma. So I found these passages from Pema Chodron in Start Where You Are, where she frames it in a nice way. She says, people get into a heavy-duty sin and guilt trip, feeling that if things are going wrong, it means they did something bad and they are being punished. That's not the idea at all. The idea of karma is that you continually get the teachings that you need to open your heart. This is what I was kind of paraphrasing the other night, so I thought I'd share it here. To the degree that you didn't understand in the past how to stop protecting your soft spot, this place that we really want to get in touch with, our sort of Buddha nature, if you will, how to stop armoring our heart, we're now given this gift of teachings in the form of our own lives to give us everything we need to open further. So this is, again, a way of framing what we're experiencing. So when we have this situation that's going on in the world now, or future things that might seem threatening, fearful, we actually look at this as a gift. And it's a karmic creation. We've created this through the force of our mind. We can now work with it through the force of our mind, opposing it, going in different directions, learning from it. Let's go on to compassion and bodhicitta. Again, in the Mahayana tradition, one of the most important ways of opening up to our experiences. His Holiness went on to say also, someone who is engaging in the bodhisattva practices seeks to take others' suffering onto himself or herself. When you have fear, you can think, others have fear similar to this. May I take to myself all of their fears? Of course, I dabbled in this too. I have to admit, what didn't become my main practice. As I said, I spent a lot of time, meditating on thinking about renunciation through what we've gone through so far. But you have to stay in touch with the suffering of others, and you have to see that the fear that you're experiencing isn't yours alone. What's going on in the world, and especially the fear that many people who've contracted the virus or who are succumbing to it and in the hospital right now and intubated and everything, that this is an important thing to stay open to, especially on this bodhisattva path where we recognize that that is what we're here for, is to keep opening our hearts to the suffering of others so we can develop ourselves most completely to be a benefit to them. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot more about compassion and bodhicitta because that's the weekend topic, really. We're talking about over the weekend the 4 immeasurable thoughts that are the way that we moisten our minds, feed our minds so that bodhicitta can arise very naturally. And so we're going to get into that this weekend and developing those heart qualities. But absolutely, this is such an important part. And as I said, I sort of, dabbled in this to some degree of doing some Tonglen with the suffering I was seeing going on. And I still try to go back to that. But for whatever reason, the renunciation teachings seem to be how I'm working with my fear or trepidation around what's going on. And then His Holiness points out this, that even though you are opening yourself to greater suffering through doing like Tonglen, taking greater suffering to yourself, we talked about that on Wednesday, your fear lessens. You don't feel so fearful. You actually feel kind of courageous in the midst of that. In fact, the practice of Tonglen is one of the most courageous practices we can engage in to kind of keep ourselves open to what's going on in the world around us and to see that we're not alone in our fear. And then wisdom. Another technique, is His Holiness says, is to investigate who is becoming afraid. Examine the nature of yourself. Where is this I? Who is I? What is the nature of I? Is there an I besides my physical body and my consciousness? And then he says, this may help. So it may help, and it will definitely help if you're able to get it at the deepest level. Of course, realizing emptiness, realizing that wisdom takes a lot of concerted effort, but it is the final thing that undoes the confusion that's at the root of all of our suffering. And then in terms of tantric methods, I found some nice passages from another Buddhist teacher in that same Tricycle magazine that dealt with fear. And the article there was called What Green Tara Can Teach Us About Fear. Some of you may already feel a connection to Green Tara, but I've always had a connection since I started my FPMT path pretty much. But it says here, Tibetan Buddhism offers many methods for recognizing, overcoming, and ending disturbing emotions, including fear. Some are grounded in an awareness of the body. And of course, tantric methods are using not the grosser body, but the subtler body to work with and to tap into energies in the body, that help us to overcome fear and the other delusions. Green Tara, she says, who represents the aspect of a Buddha that protects us from fear, also represents the energy winds of the body and the breath. And so again, Green Tara is said to be Tara the liberator. She liberates from the 8 dangers, the great fears that we all are living with that are induced by our delusions. And so Green Tara can be a very powerful practice to bring to mind when we are having things kind of going askew, going wrong. Tara's influence is the capacity to act, to move through life and accomplish our aims. Indeed, her name means she who ferries across, she who kind of takes us from where we are to where we ideally could be, greater state of well-being. So again, most of you know Green Tara and have some familiarity with her. Her mantra, Om Tare, Tu Tare, Ture Soha, is a very powerful one to recite, as well as the praises to the 21 Taras. So those are, again, some of the techniques that I would suggest working with. I'm going to tell you one story about Tara that I heard from a student who came here to our center in Santa Fe. She's a Zen practitioner, but she's Welsh, and she had studied at a center in Wales. I think she's Welsh or British, but anyway, or English, I mean. But she came from the UK and studied I think it's called Lamrim Center in Wales. And there was one time, I guess they're in a little bit of a remote area with a lot of woods around them and what have you. And when students come there for a retreat or something, they often go wandering out in the woods. Well, one woman had gone wandering in the woods, and it got to be dusk and she wasn't back. And then it got to be dark and she wasn't back. And they were getting a bit worried about her and fearful for her safety. And so they went and asked the geshe at the center at that time what they should do. And the geshe was in the residence above the Gompa. And so he said, everyone go down into the Gompa and start reciting the praises to Green Tara, to the 21 Taras. And so they go down there and they start doing this. And they've been doing the praises for a while. And suddenly they hear kind of a thump, thump, thump from upstairs, like, okay, you can stop now. And within minutes after this woman showed back up at the center. And they went out to greet her and to find out, well, I hope you were okay. What all happened? And she says, no, I got very disoriented. I was out walking through the woods and I couldn't figure out where I was. And then as it got dark, suddenly I saw a green light. And the green light guided me back, to the center. And of course, there was no green light at the center. They don't have like a flashing green tar or something. Um, but it was really kind of touched me when I heard this story, because I have complete faith and conviction that this happened. through the power of the Geshe, perhaps, again, in his great realizations, who maybe even him being an enlightened being, inducing them to do this as sort of a mechanism by which they're activating that kind of concern out of fear for the danger that this woman might be in out there on her own in the woods. And then, this rescue, if you will, that occurred. And so, yeah, I don't know that I've heard a lot of other Tara stories. I won't tell you any of the other ones. Some of them were told to me in confidence, so I don't really want to, you know, share those. But I've had my own experiences around Tara and always found her to be kind of a useful tool to beckon up at those times. Not like you're kind of saying, rescue me, free me from my fears and what have you, but what we're really trying to get in terms of touching into Tara is that we want ourselves to free ourselves from our own fears. Tara represents that kind of active energy that gets in there and does the work that needs to be done so that fears can be completely dismantled. All the things that are causing them can be made ineffective by virtue of our deeper wisdom and understanding, and of course our compassion to act on all of that. So I think that was pretty much it. I don't know, I do have one more part that I should go into really quickly since I'm running out of time. But that was all I had in terms of the ways of working with fear. What does fearlessness look like? Again, some tricycle teachings on fear. John Daido Lori Roshi says, the fearlessness of the great spiritual teachers like Moses, Jesus, Saint Teresa, Buddha, and Bodhidharma was the fearlessness of the spiritual warrior. Different from stoicism, naivete, or arrogance, this is selfless, generous, and compassionate. Fearlessness is not a matter of ignoring fear, but of really acknowledging it and being empowered by it. We're confident that we can deal with whatever presents itself to us, regardless of the outcome. And this is the gist of this last part of like, what does it look like to be fearless? Well, it doesn't mean that you don't have any fear necessarily. It means that in the face of when fear arises, we have the ability to feel empowered by it, that we can actually do something active with it. Chogyam Trungpa himself says fearlessness comes from fear. The logic is quite simple. You might ask, for example, why someone takes a shower. You shower because you feel dirty. The dirt is what really makes you want to clean up. Similarly, fearlessness comes from fear. How do you develop a fearless attitude? Only by working with fear. Just like we talked about, on Wednesday night, you only gain sort of some level of patience and fortitude by working with difficult situations, things that would normally make you angry. When we do not separate ourselves from our fear, we transcend it. Each one of us is born with the same kind of fearlessness, but we need to realize it as our own lives, the life of all Buddhas and all beings. And then a quote from Pema Chodron, to be fearless isn't really to overcome fear. It's to come to know its nature, to actually kind of, again, invite it in, see where it's coming from, and learn to work with it. And I even found this wonderful quote from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a good friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He says, courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. That's the end of my slides, but I mean, I certainly felt this in regard to, having lost this great American hero, John Lewis, recently, that, when you hear, of course, and many of us knew the stories of the actions that he engaged in throughout his life, arrested some 40 some times, for fighting for civil rights, but, to go endure such unbelievable um, pain, difficulty, putting himself in very fearful situations with a courageous conviction because he knew that what he was doing was right and needed to be done. I mean, an unbelievable courage. That's what fearlessness looks like, is when people are able to be in a place where they're confronted with something that could be very disastrous, painful, difficult, as it was for John Lewis in Birmingham and so on. But nonetheless, they act in spite of that, in the face of that. They need that to kind of feed and fuel their strong conviction to do whatever needs to be done to overcome obstacles. So in worldly examples, we see it, though John Lewis, again, embodied very much the same attitudes and ideas that we're propounding within the Mahayana tradition. The genuine selfless concern for others and the wish to be a benefit to them and help them. So we see this as a very important thing in our lives in terms of the world we live in, but certainly in our spiritual lives in terms of the means by which we can accomplish all of our goals and eventually become a fearless Buddha and enact that in our lives completely, helping others to also overcome all their suffering and fear. So I hope this has been of some use. We're at the end of our time, but I would like to open it up if there's any questions or comments. Anything that was stimulated by what I said that you'd like to share or ask about? Well, this was wonderful. I was really glad to have another opportunity to teach on this. Like I said, it wasn't so long ago that I taught it for Santa Fe, but I think it's very opportune time for this type of teaching too. Catherine mentioned in an email to me that Wednesday night was also very topical and right on target for what we're going through. But, the Buddhist teachings are so relevant to what we're experiencing. And if we can't apply them now, I don't know when we're going to be able to apply them. I mean, this is the time. Um, I think many people said that after the 2016 election, there was even a collection of advice that Lion's Roar magazine had sent out from various Buddhist teachers. And they were saying things like, this is the time we've been practicing for. This is what we've been really doing our work for. And so as much as we might have our failings, as much as we might binge every now and then on various things that, kind of distract us from the reality of what we're confronted with, we still are dedicated to a path of continuing this process, continuing to work on ourselves so that we can learn from what we're experiencing and really be a benefit to ourselves and others. So thank you all so much for joining for tonight. Let's go ahead and do a short couple of prayers like we did the other night. The first two prayers are, again, these dedication prayers, dedicating all of what we've done here tonight, as well as all the merits we and others have created to the state, to us accomplishing the state of Buddhahood, and then as the guru for all beings, as a guru Buddha, leading all beings to attain enlightenment as well. And then the second verse, once more, as I mentioned the other night, to make this strong prayer that bodhicitta, this sincere altruistic intention to benefit all beings, be generated in our own hearts and never decline, but also that it be generated in everyone in this world, especially our world leaders. I mean, just imagine the world, as I said the other night, if it was being guided by beings with bodhicitta, if they were taking into consideration the welfare of everyone and acting accordingly. How amazing, how wonderful. So let's do those two, recite those two verses with that thought, those thoughts in mind. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And then keeping in mind our incredible teachers, we've had some teachers I've referenced here tonight, and His Holiness has been one of them. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche, as our spiritual director, is certainly an important being in the lives of all of us in the FPMT. But we have many other teachers in our own tradition, as well as other traditions, as well as in other non-Buddhist traditions, who are helping others, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and maybe even people that aren't spiritual leaders, but are examples like John Lewis was in our world. May these beings have good health and long lives. May they continue to abide in this world. We need these guides. We need these examples in this world to help us and others to develop our hearts and minds fully. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally, as I did the other night, and as I like to do at the end of all teachings, is to make personal dedications. And we won't recite names or any of that, but think about the beings who you're holding in your heart right now. individuals, those who are undergoing extreme difficulty right now, obstacles to their well-being, are experiencing illness, who are dying, who have died. Bring all those beings to mind and dedicate for their welfare. Think that through what we've done here tonight, it becomes the cause for freeing them from any suffering, obstacles, and so on, and giving them the perfect conditions to develop their minds and hearts completely. And may all beings be able to accomplish that through what we've done here tonight. Wonderful. Thank you again for the opportunity to teach on this subject. And again, I hope it's of some use and that you're able to use these teachings in your life. So, all right, I will see you all for the weekend teachings.
Thank you,
So.
Don.